Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you from me to all of you for coming. The Gresham College thing is slightly out of date in the sense that I'm now retired, so I'm emeritus professor, and the department I belong to has changed its name yet again to something like the School of Historical and Something Else Studies. I can't really keep up with all of those because over time it's changed several times, but nevertheless the fact that I'm a historian of medieval and early modern London, and that I'm particularly interested in the interactions of Londoners and their built and physical environment remains true and actually covers a lot of the things I'm interested in. So today I want to talk about mapping London on the eve of the Great Fire of 1666. And as many of you will know, the first plan form maps of London were created in the decades after the fire that devastated the city centre in September 1666. If we were to follow dates, I think we're a couple of days after the end of the fire in terms of historical matching. So we can imagine Londoners in that sense of sort of dazed and horrified and not certain of what the future was as they came to terms with what had happened to the centre of the beating heart of their great metropolis. The maps that are produced after the fire enable us very clearly to mentally walk the streets, to pinpoint buildings and other features, to locate events that we might read about. They show us the metropolis as it was rebuilt after the fire and as it was continuing to spread east and west. But the challenge I'm posing or facing is, can we go back before the moment of the fire and map London as it was then with the same degree of accuracy that we seem to be able to do with the plan form maps of the 1670s and 80s? Can we recapture the London that the young Samuel Pepys knew, the London recovering from the Civil War years, enlivened by the recent restoration of the monarchy and the court, but of course in 1666, recovering from the worst ever plague epidemic? So that's what I'm going to talk about, this project to create a map of London on the eve of the fire of 1666, and to say something about the sources and the challenges and I think the opportunities. As a historian of London, I'm very conscious that it's easy to think of, to present London as exceptional. And perhaps to a group of London historians, I don't need to apologise for that. But elsewhere, I have to be a bit more cautious. Because, of course, London is, in many ways, absolutely exceptional. And the early modern period is one in which that exceptionalism was very marked. London was growing dramatically when most other British towns were static or declining. Indeed, London absorbed most of the British Isles population growth in the second half of the 17th century. It was much wealthier, more diverse in numerous ways, more politically weighty, perhaps more volatile than any other British city of the period. And these characteristics also stimulated the production of a huge volume of sources for the study of London. Now, as many of you will know, the Historic Towns Trust has already published reconstruction maps of medieval London circa 1300 and early Tudor London in around 1520. I hope you all have copies of those. If I hadn't had to walk here, I would have brought copies to sell, but if you don't have copies, they're for sale from our website. Now, when we were putting these together, published in 2018, 2019, we were able to draw on earlier work published by the British Historic Towns Atlas, the predecessor of the Historic Towns Trust, in its Atlas volume of London 1520, though the new folding maps have been re-envisaged, geo-rectified, updated in many respects with new information. So what I'm showing you here is how the Blackfriars area appears in the Atlas on the far side and in the more recent updated map on the near side. And the maps are very popular, they're very widely used. They are the Historic Towns Trust's most popular map, both individually and certainly taken together. And the sales suggest that there is interest in, enthusiasm for further historical mapping of London. Now, I taught the history of London for many years, and I was always frustrated at the lack of a good map for London in the period between the mid-16th century, when it's shown in the copperplate map, and that's the copperplate derivative published by Brown and Hogenberg on the far side, and the maps of the later 17th century, when, as I say, the first surveyed plan form maps were published. There are some new maps published in the interim, but most of these are partial, derivative, or simply not informative enough to give you that real sense, or to give you an accurate sense of what was where and how you get from one place to another. And in my view, maps are a vital tool for understanding so many aspects of the past, perhaps particularly the urban past, but of course the rural as well. Settlement patterns, layout, patterns of development, communications, neighborhood, spaces of interaction, population density and character, the impact of the environment on its inhabitants. I have a particular interest in death and burial in the urban context, and I see the management of the spaces of the dead, the churchyards and the other places people were buried, as something that made a significant contribution to urban culture and social relations. Over time, I've become something of a historian of plague, and in thinking about plague in London, I felt I really needed to understand the intricacies of the streets, alleys, and housing and their influence on mortality, as well as the impact of things like parish size and social mix on responses to plague. And in other groups who are interested in early modern London, streets and places and allusions to them are a key element in the burgeoning literature of early modern London: plays, poems, histories, narratives, satires, ballads. And a more secure understanding of topography and location would, I think, be much valued there too. So I've long cherished the idea of creating a reconstructed, large-scale map of London in the 17th century, in collaboration with the Historic Towns Trust, of which I've been a committee member and a trustee for many years, and I'm currently chair. It's been a long story to get this far, many proposals, applications, revisions, and so on, but it is finally off the ground and underway, thanks to a very generous grant from the London Topographical Society, smaller grants from other parties. It's an expensive project because even though quite a lot of the work going into it is done for free, because it involves literally hundreds of hours of skilled professional cartography, as well as the eventual costs of printing and publication. While we have some financial guarantees that we'll be able to complete it, I should say that we are still fundraising, and that also to ensure that all the costs are fully covered. And any donations which can be made through our website are very welcome, and you can get gift aid on them from individuals. The main asset of the Historic Towns Trust, sorry, I missed out a slide, but this is the one that shows you the difference between London, which hasn't come out particularly clearly, in Moorfields in 1560 and Moorfields again in 1676. But what I was going to say was that the main, one of the principal assets of the project is the Historic Towns Trust cartographic editor Giles Darks, who created the medieval and Tudor London maps in collaboration with historians, and who indeed nearly all of the Historic Towns Trust map output. He brings years of experience in historical mapping, as well as highly skilled cartographic expertise. At the moment, the project has the assistance of 3 excellent research assistants, thanks to grants from the British Academy and the City of London Archaeological Trust. But by next year, I'll be doing most of the historical research myself, unless we can raise more funds to keep them on. Our aim is to complete the research, writing, and cartography by the end of 2026 or early 2027, and to bring the work to publication in the summer of 2027. Now, before discussing how we are making the map, I'd like to explain why we're going for the eve of the Great Fire rather than any other early modern date. Because we could, of course, have chosen an earlier date. There would certainly be an interest in, say, Shakespeare's London. But London's development is a continuum, and without a fixed point such as the fire, I think we're at risk of blurring exactly what moment in time is depicted. The fire is a marker in London's development. It's a widely known date. It certainly helps us when selling the project. Managing the aftermath of the fire and the rebuilding generated a significant amount of helpful documentation for the immediately pre-fire layout of the burnt area. And the early 1660s also produced another invaluable source for mapping, the nationwide hearth tax, a tax on properties that was necessarily organised topographically. Detailed assessments survive for much of the city and most of the suburbs. And together, these give us two sets of closely dated information and enable us to be clear that what we are showing on the map represents a really quite focused point in time. Choosing the 1660s also more or less dictated the way in which we're going to have to present it, that is to say, the atlas format. London's population had expanded at least fivefold since the 1520s. The built-up area had sprawled in all directions, and it's simply not possible to cover the whole of 1660s London on a single sheet at the scale we want to use. And the atlas format allows us to make a sort of more complete presentation, an introduction outlining London's development since the 1520s, some additional maps at a much smaller scale, and a generous gazetteer or street directory covering all the names and features on the map. But the print format has limitations, and we also intend to compile a fuller gazetteer to be hosted online, which can include sources, links, and updates. And we'll also be exploring ways in which the digital map files that we will produce can be used and shared. So, for example, we'd certainly aim to share the digital map with the Layers of London website, which again, I'm sure you're very familiar with. It already hosts our maps of medieval and Tudor London. And indeed, actually, that's the way in which many people first come across our maps of medieval and Tudor London. So historical mapping draws on several different kinds of evidence: cartographic, documentary, pictorial, physical, standing buildings, and archaeological remains. And when I was thinking about this presentation, I initially thought I would structure it around different types of sources, looking at maps and then at documents and so on. But I quickly realized that a more integrated approach, focusing on particular problems or issues, would actually work better, since this is how maps are actually made. In practice, we have to proceed using different sources simultaneously, bringing them into dialogue with one another while respecting the different kinds of evidence that they offer. We're also having to balance the overview with the detail. So it makes sense to collect some kinds of information on a London-wide basis, but when it comes to actually making that, translating that into map form, we'll be proceeding parish by parish. The three research assistants are mostly working on overview tasks, creating a gazetteer of street names for London as a whole, and compiling information on early modern London's built environment via a systematic search of archaeological and related publications. But as an early priority, we focused on mapping 2 pilot or sample areas in order to test the process of supplying data to the cartographer and how he maps this. And this has actually been very helpful going forward, raising unexpected problems and pushing us towards new solutions or workarounds. So what I'm doing today is to focus on 3 of the elements or issues that we need to get right in our map: the street lines and layout, the names on the map, and specific features such as churches, company halls, and palaces. Obviously, this is a very summary description of these, but a way of sort of giving you a sense of how we're proceeding. So the first thing is reconstructing the outline street plan of London before the fire. Now, all historical mapping involves some degree of editing back, starting with an accurate surveyed map, usually of the 19th century, subtracting features and changes between the source map and the period we want to show, and restoring lost features. For the street outlines for London as a whole, the 3 main sources are the large-scale Ordnance Survey maps of the 19th century, the earliest plan form maps of London from the 1670s and 80s, and the pre-fire pictorial maps of the 1640s and 50s. For our purposes, a large-scale Ordnance Survey map needs to be chosen, digitised, scaled to our base. For both Atlas main maps and town and city historical maps, the Historic Towns Trust follows the presentation standard shared with the International Commission for the History of Towns Europe-wide Historical Atlas project. That is 1 to 2,500, or about 25 inches to the mile. For our multi-period town maps, we normally choose as the base an Ordnance Survey map from the second or third series of 25-inch maps from the 1890s to 1900s or from the 1920s. For this project, while we are presenting the map in the Atlas at 1 to 2,500, we're actually having digitized a larger scale map, 1 to 1,056, from 1893 to 5. And this is one of the sheets from it. I'm sorry, it comes out very faint on screen, but I'm sure you're familiar with the 19th century Ordnance Survey maps. Once you decide which map you're going to have, you also have to choose which method of digitization. You can have raster digitization, which effectively creates just a simple digital image of the original map. All lines have equal value. Or vector digitization, which separates out the features of the map into different layers. So, for example, words or other features can be turned off. We're going for vector digitization, which is considerably more expensive, but also much more versatile in that it also gives a more aesthetically attractive and legible results. And of course, you know, the professional digitization is the start. There's quite a lot more work to be done to transform those into geo-rectified base on which we can work. Once we have the digitized version of the large-scale Ordnance Survey map, we can think about how to edit it to show the London that we want. And the first step, as I said, is to move back to the immediate post-fire period when the first surveyed plan form maps of London were published. A cartographic survey of London was commissioned immediately after the fire, of the city anyway, and the resulting hand-drawn surveys were embodied in several different formats. This is Ogilvy and Morgan's map of the city, published in 1676, at a scale of about 63 inches to the mile, or 1 to 1,200. Again, I'm sure many of you are familiar with Ogilvy and Morgan. Then there's William Morgan's map of the whole metropolis in 1682, smaller in scale, 14.5 inches to the mile. And the two obviously have different virtues, but complementary ones. So Ogilvy and Morgan is much closer to the fire in date, much larger in scale, but it only covers the city. It omits the spreading and populous suburbs. Morgan is smaller in scale, but as you can see, it covers a whole metropolis, which is something that we also aim to do. And overall, we're tending to use Morgan's 1682 map as our guide. It's important to note that while these are surveyed to the standards of the time, they do need quite a bit of adjustment to fit the Ordnance Survey maps of the 19th and 20th centuries, let alone the geo-rectified, geo-referenced maps we use today. They were surveyed, but this was done using chains and linear measurements, which can lead to quite serious cumulative errors. Trigonometrical surveying, which is triangulating from fixed points, such as church towers, was only really developed in the 18th century, and Roke's mid-18th century map is the first one to be surveyed in this way. It's also important to be aware of several anachronisms in the maps as they were presented. So Ogilvy and Morgan of 1676, as you can see, it shows a complete new St. Paul's Cathedral, which, as many of you know, is not finished until early in the 18th century. It also shows, and this confuses a lot of people, the planned Thames side quay, which was never fully implemented, certainly above the bridge. Morgan combines the plan form map with elevations of certain buildings, which obviously changes how you can use it. But together, they're really important at confirming the network of streets, the extent of the built-up area in the 1670s and the 1680s. So it would be possible to map these directly onto an Ordnance Survey base, and we'd have a very good modern historical map of later Stuart London. But of course, we're aiming for a map of London before the fire. And it's a period of rapid change and development, partly, of course, the result of the fire driving society and commerce west and east. So we certainly can't assume that a street or feature that was there in 1682 or even 1676 was necessarily there before 1666. It's worth remembering that London is growing at such a rate, it may be taking in something like 8,000 to 10,000 net people per year. So that's an enormous influx of new people to be accommodated. So even within a very short space of time, 10 years, there could be quite significant changes to the built environment, to the development. So for the shape and extent of the metropolis as a whole, we can compare the 1676 and 1682 maps with pictorial maps of London in the 1640s and 1650s. And the most complete and large scale of these is the, quote, exact delineation of the cities of London and Westminster and the suburbs thereof, which was published by Faithorne and Newcourt in 1658. In terms of publication date, it takes us back some 8 years before the fire, and maybe more, because it was based on surveys of the early 1640s. So there's always the question of how much had changed by the time they published it. And obviously, its different conventions make it an approximation rather than an accurate plan. Street widths are exaggerated for clarity. Houses are compressed. Side streets and alleys are obscured. And there's also the matter of scale. It's hard to work out, but it appears to be about 11 inches to the mile. That is quite a bit smaller even than Morgan. In the 1650s, the artist and mapmaker Wenceslas Holler planned a large and multi-sheet map of London that would have been about twice the scale of Faithorne and Newcourt, but only one taster sheet for Drury Lane and Covent Garden was published in 1658. But it looks as though Holler did quite a bit of work for the other sheets of the map, and that he was able to draw on these when immediately after the fire, he worked on producing a plan largely of the burnt area. And his map of burnt London seems to be, as it were, a bit of a mixture of a new plan of the burnt area plus probably existing work on the area that hadn't been burnt. Within the burnt area, obviously, much is a bit schematic or stylized, but it's still an important source for the areas that it covers. So if we compare Faithorne and Newcourt with Holler and with Ogilvy and Morgan, for instance, and that this is Faithorne and Newcourt on the far side, Holler down there, Ogilvy and Morgan here. I've used the red blob to mark the Church of St. Botolph Aldgate, which there is still a Church of St. Botolph Aldgate, but it's obviously not the one that was there before the fire. So this gives you some sense of what we would need to subtract from Ogilvy and Morgan to get back to the layout in earlier years. We need to subtract some, but not all, of the network of streets and alleyways that are spreading over the fields to the east of the city. But documentary, rather than cartographic sources, will have an increasingly important part to play in identifying streets and features before the fire, as I'll be explaining in a minute. So the steps I've been describing so far for recovering street lines, coordinating a surveyed Ordnance Survey map with earlier, less accurate ones, whether they're plan form or pictorial, that's an approach that could be applied to most towns and cities. But for central London, before the fire, we have a unique set of problems, but also a unique set of sources. So the fire of the 2nd to the 6th of September, 1666, burnt out the city centre, destroying some 1,300 houses, rendering perhaps 60,000 people homeless. Numerous public buildings, from the Royal Exchange to Guildhall, 89 parish churches and St Paul's Cathedral, and several £1 million worth of domestic and commercial goods were all destroyed. But ironically, the fire, or rather the subsequent rebuilding, generated sources that make recovery of the mid-Stuart street plan somewhat easier. So, as is generally known, while several imaginative proposals for rebuilding the city along more rational or geometrical lines were put forward, including the extremely boring grid plan that we can see here, as we know, the idea of such wholesale replanning was deemed impracticable, far too costly in time and money, and the streets were rebuilt very much as before, with a few exceptions. The opportunity was taken to widen and straighten some streets, to lay out a couple of new ones, to relocate the food markets to off-street sites, to rationalise, that is, to reduce the provision of parish churches within the walls, and to improve landing facilities along the commercial waterfront. And although we're familiar with Pepys's castigation of the Mayor of London, his failure to do very much about the fire, the city actually stepped up pretty impressively with the challenge of managing the post-fire crisis, organising and directing the rebuilding, collaborating with the Crown and Parliament to survey the city, set out regulations, and secure funding for building works. This is just a list of some of the sources that are generated by this. This overall survey of the city includes notes on street widths and sketches of some of the intended improvements. Hope that's clear enough. It's obviously not scaled, it's not accurate in that sense, but it's certainly something that one can use to map onto to an accurate base. We know, for example, that a new street, King Street, running south from Guildhall to Cheapside, cut through existing properties, and south of Cheapside, the line continued as another new street, Queen Street, opening up what had been the narrow, irregular line of a street called Soper Lane, and continued on down towards the river. Of the sources generated by the fire or the rebuilding, what's most important, I think, is the system for controlling private rebuilding, which required owners to have the foundation of their houses surveyed by one of the city-appointed surveyors before they could begin to rebuild, and that those regulations also dictated things like minimum room heights, scantlings, and materials. The surveyors were responsible for staking out any new street lines, for certifying the owner's right to compensation if part of his land had been cut off for widening a street. The drawn plots and surveys, and at the far side you can see an 18th century copy of one of the surveyor's notebooks. These would allow for a jigsaw puzzle approach to reconstructing the plot layout before the fire, or at least for those areas for which the surveyor's books survive. We're not intending to do this in full, not least because the scale of our map won't really be large enough, but where it has been done, we'll certainly draw on it. But the evidence that it contains, that those surveys contain for example, street line alterations, contributes to our programme. So all of those property owners whose plots were cut into or cut through to make King Street, for example, were compensated for the ground they lost, though some, of course, gained by having a new street frontage. Likewise, property owners along Cheapside and Poultry mostly lost small slips of land as the frontage was straightened and widened, and as Poultry was widened to ease the flow of traffic. And as well as these sources, there are the records of the court set up to arbitrate landlord-lessee disputes over rebuilding terms, the so-called fire court. Here, there are no graphic representations, but plenty of evidence of ownership, the impact of improvement schemes on the viability and profitability of rebuilding particular sites, and of course the names by which streets and buildings were known at the time. In some cases too, there's valuable information on land use, so the age and the size of the houses, the shops, the warehouses, wharves, stairs, and cranes. The next problem, this leads us on to the next problem, is the names on the map. A map obviously isn't just lines on a page, it has to identify and name features. And one of our aims is to produce an accurate street directory for London on the eve of the fire. And for this, we need to know not only what streets existed and where they ran, but also what they were called by contemporaries. And in a densely built up city like London, there's a profusion of names to deal with. The names of most of the major streets were well established by the 16th century, but it's the side streets and alleys and the new streets being laid out in the huge expansion of London after the early 16th century that need more careful research. Ogilvy and Morgan's city map and Morgan's Greater London map were both published with extensive street directories that were keyed to the maps. They tend not to have a lot of names on the map, but they have little codes telling you how to look something up in the gazetteer. And these do provide us with a useful starting point. But as before, the fact that a street is named in 1676 or 1682 doesn't mean we have to assume it was there earlier. It might be a new name for an old street or a new street altogether. So we need to check them all against earlier sources. The immediate post-fire surveys have some street names, but not a lot of detail. Holler's map, as you can see, names a number of streets, but they're rather major streets and ones that we, in a sense, already know about. It's just useful to us to be able to say, okay, well, this is what he could see, this is what he knew was there. But this is where other sources held by the city, and in particular, the foundations posting books, the ones which listed the owners who came in and paid the fee to have their foundations surveyed, as well as the foundation surveys themselves and the records of the fire court, are an important source for street names current at the time of the fire. There are two kinds of foundation posting book, one which is arranged by date, so it simply says who paid on which day to have their foundation surveyed, and this, you can see that even the first page gives us half a dozen names in current use. But then there's another set of book that is organized by place, and this too gives us a series of names that we can say, okay, well, this is what everybody at the time used or understood these places to be called. But then moving away from civic sources, a second major source for street and place names is the assessments for the nationwide half tax, which was established in the early 1660s as part of the restoration settlement of government finance. For London, we're fortunate to have returns for a large part of the city for Lady Day, the 25th of March, 1666, together with some for 1662 to 3 and one for Westminster for 1664. The map here, which is taken from the edition of the London Middlesex half tax, to which I contributed, shows you the coloured areas are the ones where we have Lady Day 1665 returns. The uncoloured areas are ones for which those returns don't survive, but in general we do have returns for 1662 to 3, which is as good as we're going to get. So we have more or less metropolis-wide coverage. But the real value of the half tax, the real value is that it covers the whole metropolis, not just the city. Not all parish or ward returns are very detailed, but some of them give long lists of streets, alleys, and courts that make up a neighbourhood, thus confirming names or even the existence of these streets and courts before the fire. The return for the parish of St Margaret, Westminster, for example, gives us some 80 street names, ranging from Codpiece Court to Thieving Lane. And for many of these, there's no other easily accessible source to say these were in existence at the time of the fire. As well as street names, the half tax returns identify the presence of noble residents and premises such as the Inns of Court and the Inns of Chancery, which we'll certainly want to show on the map. There is one slight problem in that this is London and Middlesex that we have edited, published, made generally available. Those for Surrey have not been published in the same detail, but the British Half Tax Project is, however, tackling these, and we hope very much that we'll be able to benefit from their work and can avoid duplication. In addition to streets, we need to determine the contemporary appellations for London's 130 parish churches. For this, we're taking the listings in the Bills of Mortality, the published weekly and yearly totals of burials from plague and other causes. These were widely disseminated and read, and they both represented and helped to consolidate the names of the churches in common use. There are some variations between the weekly and the yearly listings, but together, and with cross-checking against, for example, the listing of churches in Holler, I think we have a very defensible list. Most of the variations from 19th century use are minor, but it's worth noting, for example, that All Hallows was commonly spelt as one word and not two. The two churches dedicated to St. Mary Magdalene were evidently known to contemporaries as St. Magdalene. The two dedicated to the Holy Trinity were generally known as Trinity or Trinity Church, and that St. Vedast was known at the time as St. Foster. So all of these were adopting the mid-17th century name. But we did decide to call St. Bride in Fleet Street by the name St. Bride rather than St. Bridget. Both forms are current in the 1660s, but St. Bride was clearly superseding St. Bridget, even if it hadn't yet done so completely. There are several other potential sources for street names, though the law of diminishing returns will set in at some point. A large-scale and accurate map of early 1660s London will surely be valued by readers of Samuel Pepys's diary, and his diary is in itself an important source of names and usages. As you can see, I've indicated which of the names that he cites on just one single page. Likewise, other autobiographical writers of the period, such as John Evelyn, Nehemiah Wallington, Catherine Austin, will be worth checking. And beyond these, if we have time, sources that have been digitized and or indexed and are easily accessible will be the most rewarding. One of the research assistants, Joe Saunders, is tasked with creating the Gazetteer of Streets, starting with Ogilvy and Morgan's Gazetteer, and then Morgan, Holler's maps and the half-tax returns, and he's well on the way to doing so. One important source, but one that is very lengthy to search systematically, is Henry Harbin's Dictionary of London, published in 1917, now generally available on British History Online. Harbin didn't have access to or use all of the sources that we can, and his focus is on the city only, but he is pretty thorough. In particular, he used the Gazetteer to Ogilvy and Morgan's map of 1676, and he's careful to state whether a name appears on that map for the first time or can be found earlier, at least from the sources that he drew on. So it would be very desirable to go through Harbin, checking off the names from Ogilvy and Morgan. If he didn't find them any earlier, we need to be cautious about showing them on our map. What I'm showing here is a little bit from, as you can see, again, next to St. Botolph Aldgate, and this also shows you as to whether the key that Ogilvy and Morgan used to indicate places. So I've Cock and Hoop Yard, Crown Alley, Red Lion Court, and so on. Interestingly, though all of these names are listed in Harbin because he was using the Gazetteer, he didn't find any of them any earlier. So maybe we shouldn't show them. But other research shows that there was a Richard Hendricks in this part of the parish in 1666, and Cock and Hoop Yard could be the same as Cock Yard in Houndsditch Precinct in 1637. This illustrates one of the problems with alleys and courts, that their names as well as their actual forms could be fleeting and changeable. But the two inns that are shown here are both known by these names from the reign of Elizabeth, the Crown Inn and the Three Nun Inn. Another problem we have is which form of any given name we should use. 17th century spelling is far from uniform or standard, and while those who recorded names were obviously literate to some degree, when we have a variant name form, is this an authentic usage or the result of a weak grasp of spelling practice? And this extract from the half-tax for St Giles in the Fields at the bottom of Tottenham Court Road, or here Tattenham Court Lane gives some idea of the problem. And there's also the subsidiary question of should we standardise the spelling of common nouns like street, court, lane and alley? We're still refining our criteria for this, but the emerging principle is that we will use the names given in the half tax where we have them, except where they vary significantly from other contemporary uses. And one of the things we'll be able to do if we have the online street directory we can use the street directory in the Atlas volume to note variations and the online gazetteer to expand a bit more on the choices that we've made. Finally, other features on the map. Here the questions are, what was there? What was it called? What did it look like? This is the key to our map of 1520, and it gives you some indication of what we need to represent, what we think we need to represent, and how we're going to do so. And some consistency from one map to another is obviously important. Up to this point, we've relied largely on cartographic and documentary sources for street plans and street names. Now we can also bring in pictorial sources and material remains. And for this part of the work, we'll rely much more on the research of others, the numerous publications on individual buildings, for example. The artist and mapmaker Wenceslas Holler, who was in London from 1636 to 42, and again from 1652 to his death in 1677, is the source for many of the best views of buildings, streets and scenes of London before the fire, as well as the maps I've already mentioned. So his depictions of Old St. Paul's, for example, are vital primary evidence for what the medieval cathedral was like. And here we've got a variety of his views, either as it were foregrounded or backgrounded, and very useful for us to think about what this tells us about the form of the built environment. There are a few other pre-fire views of London and its buildings, but given that outside the area burnt in 1666, many pre-fire buildings survived into the 18th century or beyond, later street views can also provide valuable evidence. So here we have St Michael le Quern at the west end of Cheapside, burnt in the fire. This is the only record we have of what it actually looked like. But on the right, we have St Giles Cripplegate, which should be fairly familiar to you today. It survived largely unchanged, at least until the Second World War, and much of it remains today. Not the inside, but certainly the tower is recognisable. And there's an increasing number of house plans from the 17th century, a few before the fire and more afterwards, particularly as property owners, including the livery companies, recognised the value of accurate plans of the properties that they owned. And some of these could be used, like the post-fire maps and depictions, to recover what was there in the 1660s. And I'm sure you, like me, are grateful to the London Topographical Society. Without their centuries of publication of sources for London's topography, I don't think this project would be viable at all. I mean, not just the fact that they're supporting the mapping project, the Atlas project, but all the things that they've published are making our task very much easier. And that almost all the sources I've talked about have been made available in one way or another by them. Also important to us are material remains, whether above or below ground. Very few buildings survive intact from the mid-17th century, but quite a lot of fragments do. And London has now had some 50 years or so of intense archaeological investigation and data collection. I mentioned that we have a grant from the City of London Archaeological Trust, which is allowing us to employ 2 research assistants to collect information on the archaeology of the built environment of early modern London, identifying articles, reports, publications, monographs relating to buildings and mappable features. So the 2 RAs are surveying the molar reports and publications such as these, journals such as the London Archaeologist, transactions of the London Middlesex Archaeological Society, and online and unpublished resources where that's possible. I'm hoping we may be able to fund their further work on specific, very complex sites and features where archaeology and buildings research have made a major contribution, and translating the data into mappable form will be quite time-consuming. While it will make sense to collect some of the data thematically, parish churches, livery company halls, for example, where there are some common sources or where there are indeed studies that bring different units of those types together, and we'll certainly have a checklist of places of each type. Most of the research on these will be sort of one-off places with a unique story. Our plan is for the cartography to proceed parish by parish. I mentioned that we began with 2 pilot or sample areas to test our methodology and the different approaches we might need for different parts of London. So for the pilots, we chose 2 adjacent parishes in the city, St Botolph Billingsgate and St George Botolph Lane, the lower area circled in red, and one on the fringes of then on the fringes of the metropolis, St Giles in the Fields. The 2 city parishes are within the burnt area, so they're covered by the fire sources. They include the sites of important excavations in the 1980s, as well as the interesting and challenging waterfront area. Both of them had been densely settled since the Middle Ages. St Giles in the Fields, on the other hand, represents the new spreading suburbs centred on the site of a medieval church and hospital, but with most of the buildings less than 50 years old in 1666. And also quite striking contrast between the elegant development of Lincoln's Inn Fields and the much poorer dwellings, the ones that became rookeries clustering near the church. With the suburban fringes, where development was rapid, one of our challenges will be to determine exactly what was there in 1666, how far development had spread, how complete were the West End streets and squares being constructed at this time. We won't be depicting individual domestic buildings, but we do want to show built-up frontages to give an indication of how far building had spread by that moment. So we've got a lot to do. We aim to have completed the gazetteer and the survey of sources and publications for the archaeology of the built environment by Christmas. The professional digitization of the Ordnance Survey base map will also be complete by then, but Giles will still have quite a lot of editing to do to make it into the base on which the 1660s features can be mapped. Through 2026, I envisage there will be both thematic research, ticking off parish churches, playhouses, livery company halls, and parish by parish reconstruction. There are areas where we can draw on existing studies and maps, but many more where we'll be pulling together the information ourselves. And as always, there will be more than one iteration of the map and much checking and editing. So I want to conclude by asking you a question, which is how we can draw on the strengths and the interests in London mapping and early modern London from a wider public. Should we be holding workshops? Should we be crowdsourcing? Should we just do lectures like this? Or should we find some way in which we can engage people in contributing to the production of our maps? I'd be very grateful to hear from you, to have any ideas that you'd like to bring. Thank you.